So hi there. I'm here to introduce this special episode on witchcraft and sorcery throughout human history. I'm joined today by my friend and colleague who will be our guide through these ancient mysteries. Enjoy. Alright, so for this episode we are going to talk about witchcraft and sorcery in prehistory, all the way up until the Renaissance. So that's a lot of ground to cover, and it is not possible to be comprehensive. I've done my best to make sure that what we have said is either backed up by evidence or at least plausible. But please keep in mind that much of what we know about prehistoric religions and beliefs can never be proven with complete certainty, since most of them left no written records. So everything that we know comes from archaeology or folklore, neither of which are perfect sources of information. However, just because we cannot be certain about anything does not mean that we should ignore the subject. There's a lot that we don't know about the world, but that doesn't mean that we should pretend that nothing is unknown. So in this episode, we will explore what we know and what we think we know about prehistorical witchcraft and sorcery, based on the available evidence. So let's start with some basics. What do we mean by witchcraft and sorcery? In general, we can define witchcraft as using supernatural means to cause harm, while sorcery refers to the use of supernatural means to benefit the user. It's important to note, though, that these definitions can vary wildly depending on the time period and geographical location. For example, in early modern Europe, witchcraft was often associated with the devil, and sorcery was often associated with magic and alchemy. And that's because the Christian worldview heavily influenced those definitions. But when studying prehistorical and non-Western religions, we should avoid imposing modern definitions onto those cultures. Therefore, we need to keep an open mind when looking at the evidence and allow these cultures to define what magic means in their own context. Okay, so now that we've established that, let's get into it. Since there isn't enough evidence to say that magic was used at any point before the Upper Paleolithic, we are going to start our investigation around 40,000 years ago. We know that magic played some kind of role in prehistoric religions because many archaeological sites contain objects that could be interpreted as magical, like this figurine of a woman with large breasts and hips found in the Dolní Vistana site in Moravia. Similar figurines have been found all over Europe, and they are usually associated with fertility cults. The exaggerated sexual features on these statues suggest that they were seen as powerful symbols of fertility, and it is possible that rituals were performed using them to ensure successful pregnancies and childbirth. We also know that prehistoric people kept certain types of animal bones like the scapula or shoulder blade because they could be used as a form of divination. One example is the so-called haruspices practiced by the Naro and the Senict tribes in North America. They believed that the shape of the scapula could reveal certain things about the future, like the number of successful hunts during the coming season. Similarly, the Akkadian people in Mesopotamia kept the liver of sacrificed animals and interpreted its shape and texture to predict the future. These practices might seem bizarre to us, but they were common among prehistoric and ancient societies across the globe. Another interesting piece of evidence comes from a burial site in Belgium. This grave dates back to between 32,000 and 14,000 years ago, and contains the skeleton of a man surrounded by objects that suggests he was a shaman. He was buried with ornaments made of bird bones and teeth, as well as a pendant made out of a human skull. It's possible that this man was seen as a sorcerer who could communicate with the dead, and that his grave was robbed after his death because people wanted to take his power for themselves. Grave robberies like this were quite common during the Mesolithic period in Europe, and they suggest that shamans were highly respected members of society. Sometimes archaeologists find graves where several bodies have been placed in the same pit. Usually these are male skeletons, and they are buried together with weapons and ornaments. We think that these men were seen as great hunters, and that people believed that they had the power to influence the weather and the fertility of the land. During the Neolithic, permanent settlements became more common, and as a result, communities had to deal with conflicts over land and resources. As warfare became more frequent, the role of the shaman shifted from a healer to a warrior. Shamans were still respected, but now they were more likely to die violent deaths. Some archaeologists argue that this led to the development of more secretive forms of magic, but there's no real evidence for this. One interesting detail is that many Neolithic sites contain structures that could have been used for rituals, such as the famous stone hinges. However, the interpretation of these structures is highly debated, and it's impossible to prove that they were used for anything other than burial. Stonehenge is perhaps the most famous example of this type of structure, but it's unclear how it was used. Some archaeologists believe that it was used for burials, while others believe that it was used for astronomical observations or as a place of healing. There's no consensus on this issue, and new discoveries are constantly changing our understanding of Stonehenge. As we move into the Bronze Age, we see the emergence of more complex societies with social hierarchies. This led to the development of more elaborate forms of magic, which were often used to maintain social order. During the Bronze Age in Europe, shamans were typically male, whereas in Siberia they were typically female. This is reflected in the folklore of these regions, as female Siberian shamans are often associated with water and healing magic, whereas male European shamans are often associated with fire and warfare magic. Shamans were still seen as intermediaries between the human and the spirit world, but their role was now more clearly defined, and they had to follow specific rules and regulations. They were also more likely to be full-time professionals, and they often had apprentices. Finally, in the Iron Age, we see the rise of literacy, which meant that magical knowledge could be recorded and transmitted more easily. This led to the codification of magical practices and the emergence of written grimoires, or books of magic. One famous example is the Key of Solomon, which is a medieval grimoire that was supposedly written by King Solomon. This book contains instructions for summoning demons and other supernatural beings, and it was very influential in the development of Western magic. Other examples include the Picatrix, which is a manual for astrological magic, and the Grand Grimoire, which contains instructions for summoning the devil. Alright, now that we've covered the basics, let's look at some places where magic was particularly important. The first place that we need to talk about is Egypt. Egyptian religion was extremely complex, and it played a central role in the lives of the ancient Egyptians. Magic was an integral part of this religion, and it was used for a wide variety of purposes, from ensuring the fertility of the Nile River to protecting the pharaoh from evil spirits. The Egyptians believed that the universe was full of spirits, and that these spirits could be manipulated using magic. They had a rich tradition of magical practices, and they believed that magic could be used to heal the sick, to protect against evil spirits, and even to raise the dead. Perhaps the most famous Egyptian magician was Hermesus Trismegistus, who was said to have lived in the 3rd century BC. He was revered as a master of magic, and his teachings were recorded in a series of texts known as the These texts contained a wide range of magical practices, and they were very influential in the development of Western magic. Next, let's talk about Mesopotamia. Like the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians believed that the universe was full of spirits, and that these spirits could be manipulated using magic. They had a rich tradition of magical practices, and they believed that magic could be used for a variety of purposes, including healing, protection, and even warfare. One of the most famous Mesopotamian magicians was Nergal, who was the god of the underworld. He was also a master of magic, and his teachings were recorded in a series of texts known as the Babylonian Talmud. These texts contained a wide range of magical practices, and they were very influential in the development of Mesopotamian magic. The last place that I want to talk about is India. Indian religion is extremely diverse, and it has a long history. Magic has always been an important part of Indian religion, and it has been used for a wide variety of purposes, from healing to protection to warfare. One of the most famous Indian magicians was Vasistha, who was a sage and a master of magic. He was said to have lived in the 14th century BCE, and his teachings were recorded in a text called the Vasistha. This text contained a wide range of magical practices, and it was very influential in the development of Indian magic. Finally, I want to mention some references for those of you who want to learn more about this topic. First, I recommend reading The Witch in History by Ronald Hutton. This is a great overview of the history of witchcraft from prehistoric times to the present day. I also recommend reading the Oxford Handbook of African Witchcraft by Michael Jackson. This is a collection of essays on various aspects of witchcraft in Africa, and it's a great resource for learning more about this topic. And finally, I recommend watching a documentary called The Mystery of Magic. This documentary explores the origins and development of magic, and it's a really fascinating watch. Alright, so that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes. Bye-bye.